they may be out of a job in November. I'm Rick Leventhal. You're watching the Fox Report. Massive crowds gathering across the country today, mostly students, taking to the streets in the March for Our Lives. Survivors of the Parkland massacre organized the protest in response to last month's shooting at their school that left 17 people dead. The demonstrations taking place in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Atlanta, Boston, and beyond, with the main event in our nation's capital. An estimated 500,000 people flooding Pennsylvania Avenue. Surviving students from Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School addressing the crowd, vowing they will not rest until new gun laws are passed.
Inaction is no longer safe, and to that we say no more. 96 people die every day from guns in our country, yet most representatives have no public stance on guns. And to that, we say no more.
Peter Doocy was at that rally and is now reporting from Washington. Peter?
And Rick, just a few hours ago, the streets of D.C. were swollen with concerned citizens. There were so many people trying to get in. Most estimates are that there were hundreds of thousands of people here, and many that we heard from were attending their first ever political rally. And a lot were just trying to get as close as they could to the celebrities and the students on the stage in the shadow of the Capitol.
Every march, every meeting, every moment. All for that assault weapons ban to keep these weapons of war out of the hands of civilians who do not need them. All for the prohibition of high-capacity magazines, because no hunter will ever need access to a magazine that can kill 17 in mere minutes.
This big gun control march comes just a day after President Trump signed into law a bill that beefs up background checks, and he moved to ban bump stocks. The White House is just a few blocks away from today's March for Our Lives rally in D.C., but the president was out of town in Mar-a-Lago, Florida, where a spokeswoman for the White House applauded young people exercising their First Amendment rights. Still, though, the president was criticized heavily on stage and on signs held by attendees, and so were Republicans in Congress and the NRA.
To all the politicians out there, if you take money from the NRA, you have chosen death. If you have not expressed to your constituents a public stance on this issue, you have chosen death. If you do not stand with us by saying we need to pass common sense gun legislation, you have chosen death.
And the message on the stage here just a few blocks away from the Capitol was very straightforward. These activists, led by students, are going to organize campaigns against incumbent lawmakers in the midterms if they do not feel those lawmakers are doing enough to strengthen gun control laws. Rick.
Peter Doocy in Washington. Peter, thank you. President Trump spending the weekend in Florida after signing a massive $1.3 trillion spending bill on Friday to avert a government shutdown. The president had threatened to veto the legislation, but says he decided to approve it because of a much-needed funding boost for the military, even though he's making it very clear he is not satisfied with the final product.
I say to Congress, I will never sign another bill like this again. I'm not going to do it again. Nobody read it. It's only hours old. Some people don't even know what it is. $1.3 trillion. It's the second largest ever. President Obama signed one that was actually larger, which I'm sure he wasn't too happy with either.
White House correspondent Kevin Corke reporting from West Palm Beach near the president's Mar-a-Lago resort. Kevin, it sounds like the feeling at the White House is the president was painted into a corner by Congress.
Well, begrudgingly, yeah, I think you're right about that. Although, to be fair, White House officials, Rick, always say, listen, Kevin, this was a battle. It's not the war. This is not the end of all budgets, and there will be other battles to be had, especially as we get closer to October. Now, I will tell you this. They still say there's plenty of good in it, despite the castor oil taste, including more money for the military, for example. However, there's clearly less money for the wall and still hundreds of millions of dollars set aside for Planned Parenthood. White House officials say, yep, it's a bitter pill to swallow, but a necessary one, says the president.
We looked at a veto. I looked very seriously at the veto. I was thinking about doing the veto But because of the incredible gains that we've been able to make for the military, that overrode any of our thinking.
Criticism, obviously, from the right in particular, Rick, for not fully funding a border wall separating the U.S. and Mexico. But again, they say the money, the $1.6 billion, is more or less a down payment. There will be more payments as they try to fund that southern border barrier. Meanwhile, Planned Parenthood still getting over about $500 million, $500 million in this particular budget. They say they do not use federal funds to fund abortion services, but critics still wonder why they're getting $500 million. Rick?
Kevin, there was a late Friday night decision on transgender troops that apparently will restrict many who currently serve and ban others who might. Can you tell us about that policy?
Yeah, listen, here's what happened. The senior military cadre at the Pentagon have been advising the president throughout in this circumstance, and they're telling him, listen, you have to listen to us. We know what's best on the ground. Now, effectively what this does, Rick, is it means that if you're transgender and you're in the service, you can still serve. You'll be limited, however, given what you can do to serve your country. Others who hope to join the military, who happen to be transgender, the road to join the U.S. services just got a whole lot tougher. Let me share a bit of a statement from the Defense Secretary, Mad Dog Mattis. He said this: in my professional judgment, these policies will place the Department of Defense in the strongest position to protect the American people, to fight and win America's wars, and to ensure the survival and success of our service members around the world. Now, this will come as no surprise. Democrats howled immediately, in particular the minority leader, Nancy Pelosi. She took to Twitter and wrote this: no one with the strength and bravery to serve in the U.S. military should be turned away because of who they are. This hateful ban is purpose-built to humiliate brave transgender members of the military who serve with honor and dignity. Hashtag protect trans troops. Again, this does not prohibit all transgender individuals from serving in the U.S. military. There are about 5,000 of them right now. But to give you a bit of perspective, Rick, that's 5,000, which is about 0.25% of the more than 2 million current U.S. service members right now serving our country. No less valuable. I should also point that out, by the way.
Thank you, Kevin Corke, traveling with the president in Florida. For more on this, let's bring in Stephen Nelson, White House reporter for the Washington Examiner. Stephen, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
We heard from the president yesterday. He seemed frustrated with the process and procedures that he's dealing with in Washington now.
Right. President Trump oftentimes has a theatrical way of making his point. And yesterday morning shocked everyone by tweeting that he might veto the large $1.3 trillion spending bill. He left everyone guessing for a couple hours and then ultimately did sign it. He made several points in doing so. Initially, he tweeted out that he was displeased with the lack of wall funding and the lack of a DACA deal in that bill. He later added that he was upset at the size of the bill and, in his words, that no one read it before actually voting on it. So he reassured, he addressed directly to the Hispanic community and said that he was serious about a DACA deal. Yeah. And he also reassured physical hawks who are concerned about large government spending bills.
Well, the president also said that he wants the Senate to change its rules, requiring 60 votes for most legislation and go with a simple majority. But apparently that's not going to happen.
Well, that's going to be a whipping boy for years to come. Senators have been there long enough, most of them, to have been in the minority, and it's highly unlikely that they'll get rid of the 60-vote threshold. President Trump also mentioned getting a line-item veto over spending, and that is equally unlikely due to a 1999 Supreme Court decision. So unless there's a constitutional amendment, which seems rather unlikely, that is also going nowhere.
So his frustrations will likely continue. We heard from Pennsylvania Republican Scott Perry, who's a member of the Freedom Caucus, who voted against the spending bill. I want to hear that sound and then get you to react to that.
You don't bring out a $1.3 trillion spending package at 8:30 the evening before and then vote on it by noon or 12:30 the next day. We spent money on things that we told the American people we wouldn't, and we didn't spend money on the things that we said we were going to fund, essentially.
So there's a split in the party.
Well, this has been a repeated criticism that, people don't have time to read bills before the deals get rushed through.
Yep.
But I guess that's part of the the way Congress works. You make a deal and the leaders want it to pass, and it generally does. That's something that probably is not going to be changing.
The president said that he signed the bill because of the military spending boost included in it. But you mentioned some of the things that were left out of this bill. There's no fix or extension for DACA. There's no border wall funding. There's no restrictions on funding for sanctuary cities. No language to protect Mueller. There's a lot of stuff that's not in there.
Right, but he did get a large increase in military spending, and that's something that President Trump has talked a lot about. So certainly there's a give and take, and he has gotten a big win on that, at least, that he can talk about, and already has been talking about how that is going to, in his opinion, be a good thing for the military and a good thing for the U.S. position in the world.
Stephen, the president threatened to never sign another spending bill like this one, but you're not convinced that he'll stick to that.
Well, if under similar circumstances in the future he were to veto it, he would risk a government shutdown that is entirely on him. And government shutdowns historically have not been good for Republicans, and they put a lot of people's livelihoods at risk. So I wouldn't bet on him actually following through on that threat. But, President Trump is an unconventional leader, and I suppose anything is possible. I wouldn't bet on it, though.
But what we're seeing is that no one gets everything they want.
Right.
Well, we thank you, Stephen, and we're going to bring you back later in the hour. So don't leave the building. We're going to look at where Washington stands on the gun control debate, as well as President Trump's decision to bring on John Bolton as National Security Advisor. Right now, France in mourning, how the country is honoring those killed in yesterday's terror incident, including a police officer who heroically offered himself up as a hostage. Plus, grief and anger both playing out during today's nationwide rallies in what organizers are calling a defining moment in the gun control debate.
6 minutes and about 20 seconds. In a little over 6 minutes, 17 of our friends were taken from us, 15 were injured, and everyone, absolutely everyone, in the Douglas community was forever altered.
The FBI trying to piece together what led a man to drive a minivan full of propane tanks and gasoline containers into a California Air Force base. The driver, 51-year-old Hafiz Kazi, died after veering through the front gate of Travis Air Force Base and crashing. He emigrated to the U.S. from India in 1993. Police say he had no known ties to the base or terrorism.
Now the question is why? Why was he there? What led him there? And we don't know the answers to that. I can tell you as of right now, we know of no other associates that were associated to this incident. We know of no threats to the airbase. We know of no threats to the Fairfield and greater Solano County community.
3 cell phones were found in the vehicle, and police are searching social media, but so far, they say they haven't found any threats from Kazi or clues to his motivation. In France, a police officer being remembered as a hero after offering himself up to a radical Islamic terrorist in exchange for a female hostage during yesterday's supermarket siege. His death bringing the number of people killed in the attack to 4. President Trump expressing condolences, tweeting, "Our thoughts and prayers are with the victims of the horrible attack in France yesterday, and we grieve the nation's loss. We also condemn the violent actions of the attacker and anyone who would provide him support. We are with you, Emmanuel Macron." Ryan Shilcoat is in London with the latest on this.
Lots of mourning today in France for the 4 people that were killed in that attack, but lots of people also paying tribute to that policeman who said he would swap places with the woman that was being used as a human shield by the terrorist. Lieutenant Colonel Arnaud Bertrand went into the supermarket unarmed after the hostage taker said he would accept a swap, but unbeknownst to the terrorist, he kept his cell phone on so his fellow police officers outside could listen in. When they heard gunshots over the phone, they stormed the building. Bertrand was shot and stabbed, leaving him mortally wounded. The terrorist was killed by the police. But before it was all said and done, 15 people had been injured in the attack. Now, people from all over France have descended on this town. It's in the south of France. It's called Trèbes. Many of them saying they simply wanted to pay their respects to the police officer. The president of France called him a hero. The policeman's mother talked to reporters yesterday before he passed away from his injuries. She said when she heard a policeman had swapped places with one of the hostages, she knew it was her son.
I am not surprised. This is how he lives, helping others and doing his work in the most noble way possible.
Rick, that mother now has to live with the pain of outliving her son. As for the woman with whom the policeman swapped places, her name is Julie. She's said to be in shock and very distraught. Rick?
Ryan Chilcote reporting from London. President Trump appointing a new national security advisor, replacing H.R. McMaster with a familiar face and somewhat controversial choice. How will the president's pick of John Bolton impact the upcoming North Korea talks and possibly the Iran nuclear deal? Plus, emotions running high today at massive gun control demonstrations sparked by the school shooting in Parkland, Florida. Student organizers trying to keep the nation focused on gun violence.
The finish line at the end of the march here today in Parkland and all the marches around the country is our beginning line. We are just getting started.
Rallies taking place from coast to coast today under one common theme: curbing gun violence, especially in schools. The March for Our Lives, spearheaded by a group of Parkland, Florida students after a gunman killed 14 of their classmates and 3 faculty members on Valentine's Day. Matt Finn joins us now from Parkland. Matt, what happened down there?
Rick, more than 10,000 people participated in the March for Our Lives here just a couple steps away from Stoneman Douglas High School. The air here is still heavy and somber. We want to briefly show a live look at the memorial that is continuing to grow. There is still a line of traffic outside of the school as people stop to pay their respects or leave behind mementos. Today's massive crowd in Parkland, a part of the nationwide March for Our Lives movement. Marchers and protesters here say they aren't entirely against guns and the Second Amendment, but they want compromise, a ban on AR-15s and assault weapons, and closing loopholes on background checks. Here's more from a Stoneman Douglas student.
This movement does not seek to repeal the Second Amendment. American citizens have and always have had the right to bear arms. But an AR-15? That is a weapon of war that no citizen needs to possess, let alone an individual deemed mentally ill.
The theme of the nationwide rallies today is enough, but here in Parkland there were also anti-NRA and anti-Republican themes based on the posters we saw. And through Fox's reporting here on the ground, we learned that unfortunately there were many circumstances that could have possibly prevented this shooting. First of all, the school resource officer who was seen on tape not going inside. Also, responding deputies who were told to form a perimeter outside instead of rushing inside to neutralize the shooter as they are trained to do. And even school officials here who warned medical professionals that the shooter, Nicholas Cruz, was a danger to himself and talking about using a gun, although he was never involuntarily committed as school officials asked him to do. Rick.
Matt, I understand some of the Parkland students got a VIP ride to Washington for the event there.
Yeah, well, some of the students and families here in Parkland were flown from Florida to Washington, D.C. on the New England Patriots official plane. Team owner Robert Kraft flew them and arranged that, so perhaps the most exclusive method of transportation from Parkland to Washington. Rick.
That's pretty cool. Matt Finn, thanks very much. And today's March for Our Lives rallies extended beyond our borders. Hundreds gathered in Paris, Amsterdam, and Brussels, part of a worldwide protest calling for changes in U.S. gun laws. Americans abroad and their foreign allies offering support to the cause.
It's important for Americans, even overseas, to make sure that Washington knows that we are not pleased with the gun control reform and we want more.
Organizers of March for Our Lives claim today as a defining moment in the American debate over guns. Congress averts a government shutdown, but not before some last-minute Twitter drama from President Trump. Plus, students inspiring huge rallies on gun control. Protesters, as we've been showing you, flooding streets across the U.S., demanding action against gun violence. Will their protests lead to legislative action as the Trump administration takes further steps to ban bump stocks?
We are here to call out every single politician, to force them into enacting this legislation, to addressing this legislation, to doing more than a simple Band-Aid on a broken bone. The pressure is on for every person in power, and it will stay that way.
I'm Rick Leventhal, and this is the Fox Report. It's the bottom of the hour, if you're just joining us. Congress avoiding a government shutdown Friday with the passage of a $1.3 trillion spending bill. President Trump signing it into law despite calling the legislation, quote, ridiculous. So how will your tax dollars be spent? Jillian Turner has more from Washington.
President Trump has signed a $1.3 trillion spending bill that runs 2,232 pages in length and keeps the federal government open through September. But he's not pleased about it.
I say to Congress, I will never sign another bill like this again. I'm not going to do it again.
Of the thousands of pages, the president made it clear he only backs a handful of the provisions, including $80 billion in increased military spending, $1.6 billion boost for border security, and $5 billion to fight the opioid epidemic. With a price tag of $700 billion in defense spending, this is the largest payout from a single bill the U.S. military has ever seen. It includes everything from new fighter jets and submarines to a pay raise for every service member. When it comes to homeland and border security, however, the president was sold short. He'd initially asked the Congress for $25 billion for the border wall in his own proposal, but this bill includes only $1.6 billion for border security in total. Other points of contention for the president and many GOP lawmakers in this legislation is expanded funding for Planned Parenthood, public housing, the National Institute of Health, and the National Endowment for the Arts. In spite of all of this, however, the vice president insists that overall the bill is a success for this administration.
Even earlier today, in the spending bill the president signed into law, we saw the promises of this administration kept.
Some senior leaders on Capitol Hill have already made their disagreement on this point public since the bill was signed into law little more than 24 hours ago. Rick?
Jillian Turner in Washington. The March for Our Lives reigniting the gun control debate more than a month after the Parkland massacre. Student activists are vowing to keep the pressure on lawmakers until new gun laws become a reality. But not everyone affected by the tragedy is in agreement on the path forward.
I appreciate the passion and the energy that's being displayed today, and I considered participating, but my concern from the beginning has been after every mass shooting, after every school shooting, we inevitably head down the path of an argument over the Second Amendment and gun control, and it's a legislative road to nowhere, in my opinion.
Garrett Tenney has more on this from Washington. Garrett?
Well, Rick, Congress has been feeling the pressure to take some kind of action on gun control, and that's why gun reform played a big part in negotiations over the $1.3 trillion spending bill that was just passed. It included 3 items that had bipartisan support: strengthening background checks for gun sales, providing schools with funding and training to identify students who may be prone to violence, and authorizing the CDC to do research on gun violence. But gun control advocates argue that while those are good first steps, they are not enough to fix the epidemic of gun violence in our country.
We got our Safe Schools bill passed, we got that Fix NICS bill passed, and they wouldn't have happened without these students standing behind us. But we know that is not enough.
Demonstrators across the country today are calling for major reforms such as universal background checks, banning assault weapons, and restricting the sale of high-capacity magazines. But this week, Senator Marco Rubio said it's encouraging that Congress was able to pass the latest reforms included in the spending bill, but he cautioned that with an issue as divisive as gun control, lawmakers will only make progress by focusing on areas where there is common ground.
And I think now what you're seeing is a willingness on both sides of the aisle to check off the things that we agree on and get those out of the way, knowing full well that there are some other issues involving gun regulations where there is a divide here.
The Trump administration is taking action on to address gun reform as well. And on Friday, the Justice Department announced it's moving ahead with new regulations for a nationwide ban on the bump stock devices. In his announcement, Attorney General Jeff Sessions said in part, after the senseless attack in Las Vegas, this proposed rule is a critical step in our effort to reduce the threat of gun violence that is in keeping with the Constitution and the laws passed by Congress. And Rick, it is noticeable that this bump stock ban was done at the request of President Trump in despite protest by the NRA. Rick?
Garrett Tenney in Washington. Garrett, thank you. President Trump tweeting about bump stocks. He said, quote, Obama administration legalized bump stocks. Bad idea. As I promised, today the Department of Justice will issue the rule banning bump stocks with a mandated comment period. We will ban all devices that turn legal weapons into illegal machine guns. Let's bring back Stephen Nelson, White House reporter for the Washington Examiner. Stephen, clearly banning bump stocks is not enough for the crowds that we saw gathered today.
Right, but from a federal perspective, banning bump stocks may be one of the few fundamental changes that is going to happen. On other matters, the states seem to be making movements, and I think that we'll see more action toward banning AR-15s at the state level, or at least raising the age limit. And ultimately, those actions are going to be decided by the courts. Recently, federal appeals courts have upheld Maryland's ban on AR-15 sales and a 21-year age limit for buying handguns. Gun control or gun rights supporters feel like that is going to ultimately be overturned. So this debate is likely going to be unfolding more in the states and ultimately in the federal courts, which have to interpret the Second Amendment.
We've certainly heard protests like this before for tougher gun laws after mass shootings, but this one seems to be different. This event today, these events across the country, because of the size of the crowds and perhaps because of the young people who were there.
It's pretty remarkable, the size of the crowds. You're right. When President Obama was in office, if 10 people showed up to a protest, it would be a large gathering. Now there are hundreds of people all over the country. I was looking through Twitter, and there are cities I never even heard of. Harrodsburg, Kentucky, there was a picture. It looked like a pretty good crowd there. Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I don't know, if there are many congressmen up there, but it was all over, and it was really remarkable, the size of protests in small cities even.
I want to get to a tweet from Senator Marco Rubio, who said that today many are peacefully exercising their First Amendment right to march for gun ban. Many support gun ban, but many others see it as an infringement of Second Amendment that won't prevent shootings. Protest is a good way of making a point, but making a change will require both sides finding common ground. His point is that there are a lot of people who are calling for tougher gun laws, but there are also a lot of people across the country who want to protect the Second Amendment.
That's right, and there's also criticism that any gun control measures could be circumvented. The bump stock ban, you can Google a YouTube video showing how you can essentially make a bump stock with your belt loop. There are machines that will finish off AR-15 lower receivers, which essentially make unregistered, untraceable AR-15s. So this is a complicated debate, various things for policymakers to consider. And of course, there is the question of what the Second Amendment means, and that's something that we're going to, of course, be talking about a lot going forward.
I want to get to a second topic with you, Stephen, about Ambassador Bolton being named as National Security Advisor instead of H.R. McMaster. Your reaction to that move by the president?
Well, it's interesting, and critics, of course, characterize Bolton as somewhat of a warmonger. They're afraid of his hardline approach to North Korea and toward Iran. But I think it's important to contextualize this. President Trump has various advisors who he doesn't see eye to eye with on everything. He brought on Larry Kudlow just recently as his top economic advisor, who's been critical of his tariff announcements. And H.R. McMaster, who Bolton is replacing, himself is more hawkish than the president on Middle East policy. He recently called for economic sanctions on Russia and Iran for backing Assad's government, whereas President Trump has criticized the U.S. policy in the Middle East as being too involved. So it will be interesting to see how Bolton's role plays out. But right now there is a lot of concern and criticism of his hard line on foreign policy matters.
You know, Senator Lindsey Graham has an interesting take on whether or not John Bolton will actually bring us closer to war. I want to listen to what he had to say and then get your reaction to that.
So when President Trump meets Kim Jong-un, his national security advisor will be with him, and the North Koreans know without a doubt that John Bolton sees their nuclear program as a threat to the United States and will strongly advise the president to use military force if he has to, which means it's less likely we will.
Your thoughts on that? As we look at this promo for the show tomorrow morning with Maria Bartiromo, she will be speaking with Devin Nunes and Lindsey Graham tomorrow at 10 a.m. on Sunday Morning Futures. Stephen, your reaction to what Senator Graham had to say?
Right. President Trump is the ultimate decider, and he himself has threatened fire and fury like the world has never seen against North Korea. So I don't think that Bolton's sitting right next to him is necessarily going to change much in terms of negotiations. I think President Trump has articulated a pretty hard line toward North Korea in addition to being open to negotiations. So I'm not sure that he's going to have a ton of influence on that, but it will be interesting to see.
We heard from Van Hipp earlier today, who loved the choice of Bolton as National Security Advisor. What do you think about the choice?
Well, there are people who love him and there are people who hate him. He is certainly a character. He's certainly someone who has strong opinions. And from a reporting perspective, that's going to be, as I said, it's going to be interesting to watch.
Yeah, and people seem convinced that the Iran nuclear deal is going to die because of Bolton's appointment.
Well, it might have been going that way anyways.
Yeah. All right. Well, Stephen Nelson, we appreciate your time twice tonight on the Fox Report.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Well, it's the largest bombing investigation since the Boston Marathon attack. How police are being recognized for their work to put an end to that string of bombings in Austin, Texas. Plus 6 months and still no power. Now people in Puerto Rico say they're fed up with lagging hurricane recovery efforts. That story and more next.
When someone watches the news, they want someone they can trust. Our job is to cut through the talking points.
We're going to ask the tough questions because there's a lot of conventional wisdom out there that needs to be challenged.
What I'm doing is making sure that whatever
in the investigation by presenting each department head with a flag once flown over the state's Capitol building. McCall calling the investigation a textbook example of how law enforcement should work together.
This effort at federal, state, and local was unprecedented. We had 500 federal agents, including 100 ATF, 400 FBI. We had participants from Department of Public Safety, Austin Police Department, Houston, San Antonio, all coming together to bring this nightmare to a conclusion. This could have gone on for months and months, like the Unabomber case, but fortunately it didn't.
2 people died and several others were hurt in the explosions. The suspect, 23-year-old Mark Anthony Condit, killed himself as officers closed in on him. Congressman McCall says police have recovered a taped confession in which Condit describes himself as a psychopath. His motive is still unclear. It's been 6 months since Hurricane Maria made landfall, devastating the island of Puerto Rico, and nearly 100,000 people are still in the dark. Some progress is being made, and tourists are starting to head back to the island, but many say not enough is being done and are instead making the drastic choice to leave their homes for good. Brian Yennis has the latest on recovery efforts.
In Puerto Rico, this is the sound of relief. After 6 months, Jose Rodriguez, his family and neighbors in Naguabo finally have power.
I'm so happy.
The last 180 days have been a struggle.
It's so hard. I was 4 days in depression.
No power meant no running water. For 3 months, they showered with a bucket. He and his wife took turns caring for her 82-year-old father suffering from Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's.
They have air conditioning, they have fans, they have TV, all the stuff, your bed, everything, but you don't have power and you don't know.
About 100,000 Americans are still without power on the island. 1,500 workers from 56 electric companies from all over the U.S. are here.
Be this resilient after 6-7 months without power, and then to feel like they're grateful we're here. They may think they're rough, tough linemen, but some of them say they go back to the room and they cry at night.
An estimated 470,000 Puerto Ricans are expected to leave the island over the next 2 years. In hardest-hit Yabucoa, Roberto Martinez lost the roof of his home. He's now moving the family to Indiana.
To have to abandon my grandmother, abandon my mother, my family after all these years together, and to have to make a decision like this now, it's difficult.
While parts of the island are still recovering, tourists are returning to San Juan.
The cruise liners have been starting to roll up. However, we still have many hotels that are either overpopulated because of the recovery teams or that are still in reconstruction.
FEMA says Puerto Rico's recovery is at a fragile state. It's delivering emergency food and water, rebuilding infrastructure, while preparing for another hurricane season less than 3 months away. In Puerto Rico, Brian Yenes, Fox News.
Brian Yenes, thank you. The Midwest seeing some snow this weekend. Another winter storm in spring, whipping strong winds and dropping more than a foot of snow in some parts. A live report from the Fox Extreme Weather Center next. And coming up after us, it's Watters World. Here's Jesse with a preview.
Watters World has advice for the President of the United States. Plus, Diamond and Silk duke it out over smoking Joe Biden. And the pot pastor from the Cannabis Church is here tonight.
A very old abandoned building in Russia has finally been reduced to rubble. Construction first started in 1983 as a TV tower, but well, there it goes. They gave up on the project a few years later when funding dried up with the end of the Cold War. The tower remained the highest abandoned building in the world during the 90s, and since then, no one was able to come up with a lucrative idea for what to do with it, and there it goes. And this is a Fox weather alert. A winter storm dropping some heavy snow across parts of the Midwest. Even though the calendar says winter is over, blizzard-like conditions and more than a foot of snow are being reported in some areas. Let's turn to meteorologist Adam Klotz, live in the Fox Extreme Weather Center. Adam, when will it end?
Oh boy, it just seems like winter doesn't want to end. Hanging on still again another weekend. Here's what we're looking at, and this is typically when you see something like this. Warm air bumping into cold air. It's stretching from the Carolinas back across the Midwest. It's right along that frontal boundary that we're seeing all the activity, seeing once again another snowstorm firing up. If you're on the south end of this, maybe just heavy rain, but there has been very heavy snowfall, whiteout conditions. My brother lives in Indianapolis, and he said it's been a mess there today. I've seen some of the video and photos, and it really has been stretching back all the way towards Iowa. This system is going to continue to drift down to the north, or excuse me, down to the south and east throughout the rest of this afternoon and evening. But we're under winter storm watches and warnings, stretching there from the mountains and the Carolinas back across the Ohio River, back into the Midwest. That lingering into the overnight hours. I can put a hour-by-hour forecast on this for you, and you'll see the motion here eventually kind of tracking down to the mid-Atlantic and off into the coast. On the backside of this system, you're looking at temperatures in the Midwest, waking up tomorrow morning down into the 20s with the wind chill, maybe getting into the teens in a couple of places. So it is going to be on the cold side on the backside of this system. But this future radar, if you're concerned about it maybe heading off the coast like so many have done and heading back up the coast for a nor'easter, that's not going to be the case in this particular system. You see it able to push out a little bit farther, and we are going to be clearing off here, Rick, in the next couple of days, where maybe some folks are going to get a little bit of a break from some of this winter-like weather.
And no more snow in New York, right?
No, not at least for right now. Typically, you don't see a setup like this where we're looking at this stretch. That's upper level winds. It lets the cold air linger into the north, the warmer air in the south. It's been like this for maybe 3 weeks. That's not something we typically see. We're going to see a shift out of this, which means places like New York are going to be climbing into the mid-50s here next week. And at least it looks like maybe this is over for us.
And Adam, we've seen a lot of storms in a very short amount of time.
Yeah, it's almost unheard of. Again, it's all because of these upper level winds that separate this warm and cold air. Usually this moves a little bit more. It's been like this for 3 weeks. It's put us in a situation where they're just running down a conveyor belt, running into the mid-Atlantic, running up the East Coast. I do think that changes here in the next week.
Good deal.
Yep.
Adam Klotz, thanks very much. Well, get ready for bright lights and a whole lot of noise as countries battle to light up the night sky at the 9th annual Pyro Musical Competition. Thousands watching the night sky light up on the final weekend of the Philippine Pyro Musical Competition. 10 countries from around the world showcasing their latest pyrotechnics. The grand winners were Germany and the United Kingdom. The Philippines did not take part in the competition, but performed a fireworks exhibition on the first and last day. And who doesn't like fireworks? Somebody probably doesn't. You don't? And we go from dark from light to dark. In case you didn't know, today marks Earth Hour. Landmarks across the globe going dark. Take a look at the scene in Hong Kong and Paris. This event has taken place every March since 2007, designed to draw attention to climate change. And later, right here in New York City, the Empire State Building will get in on the action by turning off its lights. But don't worry, because 60 minutes later, those lights will come back on again. And that's how Fox reports this Saturday, March 24th, 2018. I'm Rick Leventhal. Thanks for spending part of your evening with me. I'll see you again here tomorrow on the Fox Report at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Water's World starts in 12 seconds.
Welcome to Waters World. I'm Jesse Waters. Legal advice for President Trump. That is the subject of tonight's Waters Words. I'm not a lawyer, and I don't even play one on TV. But I do know this. Special Counsel Robert Mueller is a dangerous man. He's a former Vietnam vet, former FBI director, and he takes no prisoners. Mueller's a patriot, and he's a man on a mission. He stacked his team with courtroom killers, including Democrat partisans, former Clinton lawyers, and Obama donors. Recall, the whole thing began with Hillary. A Hillary donor was the tipster who led the FBI to open the investigation into the Trump campaign. And Hillary herself paid for a fake dossier from the Russians that started the surveillance on the Trump campaign. Trump-hating FBI